Reducing closets and cages, abolition is a queer desire. This is Che Gossett. And the here and now is a prison house. We must strive in the face of the here and now as totalizing rendering of reality to think and feel a then and there. This is Jose Munoz in Cruising Utopia. So the geographic concern is my paper is with what Jose Munoz calls the prison house-like present, how settler colonialism does its murderous work vis-a-vis a set of carceral logics that surveil the topography of the ordinary itself, an ordinary that many of us aren't meant to survive. So part one. How do you sing an honor song for women who weren't allowed to live life here? What does grief look like when she couldn't even breathe in the first place? Sometimes dying isn't the spectacle it's made out to be. Sometimes all we know is pain. What happens when bodies no longer feel like bodies, but like wounds? We were never meant to break like this. Part two, and I do want to note that I will be discussing transphobic violence. This is a kind of trigger warning. It is January 7th, 2005, and the Albuquerque police, as T.J. Wilhelm, a staff writer for the Albuquerque Journal, put it, theorized that, and I quote, a transvestite prostitute was killed when a customer realized the man's gender, end quote. Shay Hosky, a trans woman who was Navajo and who also sold sex in order to survive a world that had already written her off as undeserving of life, was just 23 years old when she was found beaten to death in an alley. For the Albuquerque police, Hosky's murder was not so much about who she was murdered by or how it had happened, but about what she was wearing that night, how she was only, and I quote, partially clothed in women's attire. For them, her clothing and prior so-called prostitution charges were the phenomenological markings of a life stripped of existence, one not properly of this world, one that wasn't allowed to keep going on in it. As such, the police repeatedly used male pronouns to refer to her lifeless body. For them, she was killed because she wasn't who she said she was. According to Talia Mae Betcher, this kind of murder-excusing or blame-shifting rhetoric is telling. Transphobic violence is rendered impossible as such. Trans life, how it points to the breakages in gender's organizing power, becomes a geography of violence waiting to happen. Sometimes an enactment of gender, to use Betcher's phrase, becomes in the eyes of the courts so wild it turns its subject into an assailant. The so-called trans panic defense is lawful in all but one state in the US. What happens when mere existence becomes a cause for self-defense? How do we begin to count the number of lives we've lost in the name of gender? Part three. What does it mean to be a sexual illegality? Hosky staged her life at the almost unthinkable triangulation of Native, women, and trans, a triangulation that could not be teased apart from its entangled coordinates, and one that was absolutely inflected by a history of sex work. The here and now couldn't accommodate the modes of wanting and becoming and surviving that Hosky brought into focus. Hers was a body that pointed to an elsewhere so otherworldly it's hard to think about how we might have gotten there. An otherworld that perhaps too recklessly chips away at the past, present, future of settler colonialism's death grip on time itself. To be Native and trans and alive, we might say, is to be a body in protest, is to repeatedly bear witness to worlds being torn apart such that death becomes more certain than anything else. There are many ways to die, but for some of us, murder will be the most probable. Part four. Hosky was arrested 3 times, twice by an undercover cop. According to Wilhelm, who is paraphrasing the Albuquerque police, and I quote, each time Hosky's booking photo was taken, he appeared to be women. We might say to appear to be something is in fact not to be anything at all. I want to conceptualize this as a kind of post-mortem hermeneutics, the ways differently people public debate and try to reconcile the genders of the gender non-conforming dead, oftentimes making recourse to cis-normative modes of subjection. How often language fails to uphold the bodies making claim to the world. Even in death, an event that always already recognizes a prior life, trans Indigenous women are beyond the domain of the livable. Hosky was stripped of life to the point of unrecognizability, and I would say that this unrecognizability is a fate that only trans people are subject to. First, trans weakens subjectivity at the moment that it's something else becomes habitable, forcing us to account for forms of life that slip between genders' cracks, if you will. Second, the native, as Jody Bird put it, is an ontological prior whose erasure and their legal reduction to savage makes the settler as such possible. The negated non-being whose worldly losses become the settler state's confederation. The trans-native is therefore something of an ontological impossibility, the negated, if you will, whose life is precariously staged at the horizon of the near future, to evoke Jose Muniz's language. What I'm tracking here is not so much the human's discontents, but instead a kind of non-being wrenched beyond the ruins of the native's almost obliteration. That moment, the negation of the negation, does not mistake itself for the natives becoming savage, but rather points to this metaphysical space perhaps where the native, only ever properly heterosexual and cisgender, morphs into something queer than the queer, if we take up Scott Morganson's claim that settler colonialism queers all natives for elimination. Husky's murder is thus not just about the ending of biological life as such, but the ending of what her body signifies and the ways in which that particular signification always already begins to conjure up something of an other world wherein life is livable for her and others like her. She's the doubly ghosted, the phantom's discontents, that which should not latch on to the here and now but does anyways. How to write a eulogy for someone whose first breath was also her last. Part 5. It is July 7, 2009, and Terry Benally's body is found in Albuquerque just 1 month later and 3 blocks away from Watson's. Benally and Watson were both trans Indigenous women. Watson, a sex worker, was killed by a customer, Benally by someone she was meeting online. Like Hosky's, these deaths were conceptualized through the language of cross-dressing. Benally and Watson were found in women's clothing referred to as men by the Albuquerque Journal. Local trans activists in Albuquerque were quick to point out that to organize their lives under the rubric of cross-dresser was in fact to commit something of an epistemic violence, because they weren't cross-dressers, they were trans Indigenous women. Husky, Watson, and Benally could only be given discursive lives if they were interpolated as something they were not, pushed into the space of outlawed life, to use Eric Stanley's language, a space whose captives are meant to die in oftentimes the most gruesome way, the culmination of a life lived in the specter of surveillance, containment, and obliteration. Part 6. So to summarize, within 4 years, 3 trans Indigenous women are found murdered in the middle of streets or in alleys in Albuquerque, New Mexico. All of them are misgendered, 2 of them are dead named. What does it mean when your breathing becomes the event of your undoing? I rehearse these cases because they throw into sharp relief the ways in which the maintenance of gender and sexual normativities takes a racialized form in the battlefields of settler states like the United States. This is not just about the articulation of differentiation in a way that produces the very antagonisms a la Foucault that some will want to destroy, but also about the preemptive blocking of other worlds from emerging in the near future. That is, trans Indigenous life points not only to a past that was stolen from us, but also to a future that radically departs from anything we've ever known before. In other words, they become ontological blockages to this world, to a specific genre of living, and to history as such, thereby strangulating the settler state's prospects of unabated continuity. There's our bodies that surge with affects anomalous within the topography of settler colonialism. They're perhaps dreaming up the most habitable worlds for us. How can we get there in time? 7. For Jose Muniz, the present itself is something of a carceral architecture. Some more than others will live lives that look a lot like imprisonment. To say that the here and now is like a prison house is the hint to the absolutely world-shattering force of the carceral as a structure and logic. Abolition is thus not merely about the refusal of governmental forms like the prison that shore up incarceration as a method of social control and in this lawful murder, but also about the composition of a future in which prisons, policing, and other coterminous forms of surveillance cannot exist as such. For Nick Mitchell, it is precisely by, and I quote, attending to the violent consolidation of regimes of gender and sexual normativity, end quote, that we can get at the stubbornly ordinary and multitudinous ways that the carceral state reproduces itself. Trans life, especially when it takes an Indigenous form, always already hints at openings in the carceral's biopolitical mathematic, a break in the normative that, if we work hard enough, can provide the conditions of possibility for radical life, for new normativities. The carceral is thus not only contingent upon, one, the prior and ongoing dispossession of Indigenous peoples of land and sovereignty, and two, the extension of the legal apparatus of slavery from the plantation and the slaveholder to the prison and the police officer or the correctional officer, but also the trapping and eliminating of modes of being in the world that signify too wildly. How do we identify those sites of worldly enclosure that paradoxically keep us locked in a present that can't bear all of us? 8. Abolition is thus not about legal recognition or the inclusion of minoritarian subjects into the settler state's juridical folds, insofar as the law is precisely the site at which the uneven distribution of life chances, to use Dean Spade's language, is made. For trans peoples in particular, this occurs most ordinarily through the domain of the administrative, wherein the articulation of gendered life is made in a way that makes the work of survival too hard to keep up with. Abolition, then, is a mode of becoming and being with that does not require the disappearing of others in order to protect a winnowed interpretive horizon. I suspect Indigenous feminism has always partly turned to an abolitionist politics in its foundational critique of settler colonialism as a gendered structure through which some, namely Indigenous women, will succumb to premature deaths, go missing, or become locked behind bars in order for the settler state to secure its barely extant forms of sovereignty. But what of those calls for justice in the present that make recourse to the very system that produces the legal, social, and literal deaths of Indigenous women en masse? It's interesting the ways the carceral's effective structures and strictures ratchet up forms of grief and anger that align with its teleological ethic, that is, the elimination of the forms of criminality that its social world produces in the first place. How do we feel beyond the carceral? 9. Between 1998 and 2008, the number of federally sentenced Indigenous women in Canada increased by a staggering 131%, and here I'm quoting Robert Nichols' really great piece, The Colonialism of Incarceration. But we do not yet have the statistics to make any social scientific claim about the amount of queer, trans, two-spirit, Indigenous peoples who are locked behind bars, to make any claim about the wretchedness of that form of being as it is wrenched into the carceral network, to use Foucault's language. But there is an archive of heartbreak and loss that is easy to come by if you ask the right people. How does the population persist in relation to the protracted risk of obliteration of organized and unambiguously lawful violence? On the one hand, carceral power works actively, eventuating as a kind of gendered ontological death, a state of non-sovereignty, a preemptive blocking of other subjectivities from standing in as the normal, strategically displacing surplus populations in differently raced bodies behind bars, jettisoning them from the modern episteme. In short, the settler state is bent on monitoring and destroying radical pockets of indigeneity, ones that attack the ordinary and piece together something different for us. On the other hand, carceral power also works in the domain of the ontological, morphing some bodies and not others into anomalies of sorts, or to put it differently, into subjects whose being is to be disavowed, whose very materiality will be construed as the event of their elimination. Indigenous feminism must therefore take these as points of contention, turning away from the affective pull of carcerality and imagining moments of action beyond its epistemological confines. And here I'm thinking specifically about the activism that surrounded the Cindy Gladue trial in Edmonton in particular, but in Canada in general, and how calls for justice was the rallying cry for that movement, for the very system that not only sort of set up the conditions of possibility for her death, but also displayed her bodies in a way that reinscribed colonial trauma. And so I guess I'm thinking about what might justice look like if it weren't mediated through the carceral state. And part 10. Indigenous feminism performs a double worlding. One, it creates friction such that we can feel that this world is indeed a world that we can abandon. It allows us to map out its borders at once material and ontological. It is something of a compass that lets us know when we're trespassing or not, whether we've come up against the carceral or not. And two, Indigenous feminism thinks rebelliously about the potentiality of an otherwise, a potentiality labored in the here and now, one that must exist because we are still here, aren't we? What would Indigenous, feminist, abolitionist ethos look like? What would it mean if we wanted queer, trans, and two-spirit Indigenous futures? What would a world in our mode of being in it look like if the carceral didn't double as its conditions of possibility? How might Indigenous feminism dream up forms of justice that, one, aren't mediated by the law, and two, are also forms of desiring, that is, of desiring worlds that can hold up the worlds of those not meant to live life here? How might we usher in the legal and social decriminalization of sex work and trans life as Indigenous feminist praxis? According to Eric Stanley, abolition makes us not know in advance. And I would say that this is the precise kind of relation to futurity that can properly sustain queer, trans, and two-spirit life as such. For some of us, the future is already over, but that doesn't mean we don't have anywhere else to go. Thank you.
Any questions?
Right, and I guess that goes back to my point that, and I think the point that a few of us have made today, that settler colonialism works in part by sort of structuring temporality such that the contours of time itself in the ordinary will be exactly what depletes us to the point of premature death or exhaustion or depression in some of the other work I've done. And I'm thinking, yeah, about the ways in which trans Indigenous peoples, but I don't think this is a condition that is specific to Indigenous people, but to trans people in general, the ways in which sort of a death actually shores up the kind of violence that trans people were facing when they were actually living, right? And how that dead naming and misgendering actually creates a kind of life or a being who wasn't actually the one that was murdered, right? And I'm still thinking through this kind of unrecognizability, as I want to call it, but I think that it's an important line of inquiry into thinking about the way, like, the politics of who even gets to live on in death, right? So thanks for your question.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
So first of all, thank you for your very powerful presentation. In talking about violence against Indigenous violence against trans women in Alberta and Alberta Refugee, you write that they were murdered because they were perceived as not being who they said they were. And correct. And you also write that the
you just quickly repeat that question? Sorry.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk about nativeness as the end of the logic which protects the lives of cis heterosexual persons over against trans
Right.
others.
I just want to make a quick note too in your first part about the claims by police that the individual was faking it, right? And I was thinking about how in like settler states that are also, of course, coterminously anti-black, how some of us, even though we are meant to live wretched lives, in some moments won't be able to feel pain, either. And I think that's a really interesting paradox. And I'm thinking also about like hospitals will, especially in Canada, I'm thinking about if a Native person, usually Native men, enter hospitals, they will be accused of faking an illness to access drugs or medication. Yeah, how that there's a paradox where like settler states work in part by physically hurting Indigenous or Black bodies, but then sometimes like that pain like escapes like modes of thinking or sensing out, right? And I think in my work, I'm trying to almost like tease apart this argument, so we know that native people, if we follow Scott Morganson, are queer for elimination, right? And I'm thinking about how that actually covers over the ways in which some specific forms of Indigenous life, in particular queer, trans, two-spirit Indigenous life, are like doubly queered, and how that brings about forms of violence that our current epistemological tools, if you will, aren't able to properly reckon with, to theorize about, and then to actually prevent from reoccurring again. And I don't know if I have a coherent response to your question, but I do really appreciate it, and for that nice synthesis that you gave as well. So thank you.
Are there any other questions?
I just had a comment. I wanted to thank you for your talk. I really appreciate it, and the way that you talked about, like, did you call them ontological blockages? Like,
Yeah.
what those ontological blockages can, like, do, and the generativity of, like, those excesses. I just thought that was so great.
Right, so yeah, my work is always about sort of the wrong, if you will, or sort of the violence of the present, but at the same time I always try to think about the, as you said, like the sort of radical potentiality that is actually brought about when you actually think with very closely with that violence too, right? Like think about like why is it happening, and that it is a very speculative argument. Like I don't have statistics or data to back up what I'm saying most of the time, but I think that the task of imagining in a future, that future that's also decolonial, is the task of imagination, right?
Yeah.
You started off, finishing your talk, it was really good. I really enjoyed it. So you started off talking about abolition as a means to achieve freedom or to some potential emancipatory liberation. So if you were to take on this trans queer politique, then what would redress look like then? Or what would alternative forms of justice look like from a queer, trans, native feminist approach?
Great. I think the going trend, I guess in Canada at least, is this turn to reconciliation as a sort of governmental form within which redress happens, and so the government essentially sort of sets out both the juridical but also the affective terms within which history is to be reckoned with, and bodies that were harmed precisely because of that history are to be healed, if you will. That's kind of the health discourse that's also being mobilized. And so part of my work too is to think about what refusals of reconciliation look like and what they do, and how reconciliation actually can capture the emotional experiences of both the past but also of the historical present. And so abolition, often when I talk about, others talk about abolition, there's usually the imperative to sketch out its specific coordinates. And as I ended with saying, that abolition, as Eric Stanley argues, cannot be known in advance. And I think there's something in that sort of unknowability that sort of opens up space for within which radical life can survive. But I also think that abolition also knows what it's not, right? And I think it's in that not knowing, or knowing what it is not, and what we don't need in a future within which we aren't mediated by logics of containment and surveillance and incarceration. I don't think I finished that sentence, but I'm gonna. And I think that there's a lot of people doing work around like restorative justice and transformative justice, specifically Indigenous communities, thinking about what it might look like if the so-called perpetrators of crime were to be held accountable by the community itself in ways that don't automatically render them criminal and incarcerable and disposable, and that push them outside of citizenship and legal life. And I think there is definitely an archive that is emerging, and I think it'll be exciting to see what that looks like.
Thank you so much.